This slide talks about speciation, or how different species evolve. So how do you get from one species of mouse to another species of mouse? A couple different ways. Geographic isolation means that there is some sort of physical barrier that separates a population into groups. So islands, mountains, there's a body of water. Those are all ways that groups could get separated from one another. Reproductive isolation is when organisms that once interbred are prevented from producing fertile offspring, and that could be because there's a shift in seasonal differences in mating. So maybe they both mated in the spring, and now, due to some factor, one mates in the spring, the other mates in the fall. And polyploid speciation happens when chromosomes don't separate properly. This happens a lot in plants, and that's an immediate new species because it's a new set of chromosomes being passed on. So here you see an example of geographic isolation, mountain range hanging out right here that separates these two groups from these two groups. And that shows plants that have done polyploid speciation. Other types, when speciation occurs, it can happen in two different ways. It can happen gradually. Notice the word gradual in this. That's called gradualism. And it happens over time. Okay. The other one is punctuated equilibrium, and that happens in short spurts, which means, hey, for about, I don't know, let's go 100 years, we have lots and lots of new species, and then there's a period where there's not. Maybe everything is settled in its environment, doesn't need to adapt. Maybe the environment's not changing. Lots of different reasons why that could happen. And it may result, like I said, from climate change, that the weather is changing. And I would highlight these two. These are important that you know the difference between them. You see a couple of examples. Adaptive radiation is when you have one ancestral species that kind of branches off into many species that occupy lots of different niches. If you remember, a niche is a job or a role that a species plays in an environment. So an example is the honey creepers, which are birds of the Hawaiian Islands. They are very, very similar in body size and body shape, but based on where they live, they are very different in plumage, okay, so the color of their feathers, as well as beak shape depending on what they eat. So this guy shows this. These are all honey creepers, and if you take a look at them, they look very, very, very different. This guy probably gets insects out of trees or maybe uses it for nectar. These guys down here probably eat nuts, and maybe some smaller insects. So that's what adaptive radiation is you have kind of one species that looks very, very different due to their environmental conditions. Divergent evolution. If you diverge from something, you are kind of branching off. And that depends on different environmental conditions. So species become less and less alike depending on where they're at. So what this shows here, this shows an ancestral mammal, doesn't really matter what kind, but it shows how it diverges or branches off from this one mammal into these many, many different organisms based on their environment. And this would be over lots and lots of years. So we're talking about 190 million years ago that we would have this branching off starting to occur, and it would take that long for it to finish. The other one is something called convergent evolution, and this is when distantly related organisms evolve similar traits. So this is response to similar environments and selection pressures. So eventually what's going to pop up is you're going to have a shark, a dolphin, and some sort of other water animal, and they have very similar qualities because they live in the water, but they're super duper distantly related. Okay? A fish and a mammal aren't really even close to being related. So you see an example of a shark there, a dolphin there. Oh, it doesn't show it. But if you look here, I mean, they look super similar because they both live in water. But this guy over here is a fish, breathes through gills. This guy over here is a mammal and has to breathe air. All right, so super important point that I would like you to highlight. Populations evolve Individuals do not. So over my lifetime, I am not going to evolve. Maybe in 1,000 years, humans will have evolved, but as an individual, you do not evolve or change over the course of your lifetime, okay, which is what this guy says. All right, so a gene pool is an entire collection of genes in a population. If you considered our class the population, it would be all of the genes within everyone in our class. Genetic equilibrium is when, from generation to generation, the percentage of alleles in a gene pool don't change. So if you have 60% blue eyes, in the next generation you have 60% blue eyes, that's genetic equilibrium. And frequency, that's kind of a math term. It's how often a particular allele occurs in the gene pool. So 60% frequency, 60%, that's the frequency. So this shows how this might have changed just a little bit. You have 75%, 25%, and then these are the different second generations that those guys give. The mutation, we talked about those in DNA. It's rare that a mutation does result in a favorable variation that allows an organism to survive a little bit better. Something called genetic drift is when allelic frequency or trait frequency changes by chance processes. It's more likely to occur in small populations because in small populations, those individuals with those mutated or recessive genes are more likely to mate. So in the Amish population in Pennsylvania, there's a high incidence of something called polydactylism, and that means they have more fingers than they should. But the Amish population doesn't mate outside the Amish population, so there's really no way to mask that gene or cover up that gene. If you see there, that's an example of polydactylism that has 6 fingers instead of 5. And then this guy just summarizes natural selection. My bad. Variations exist within populations. Some are more advantageous, and then those organisms produce more offspring than can survive. Those survivors will make up the larger population of the, or larger portion of the population. And after many, many generations, depending on environmental factors, the original population may look very, very different than the population that's hanging out now. And you can see that in the human skull picture that I showed you at the beginning of the other lecture. So as far as evidence, something called anatomical studies is like body parts, and homologous structure is when you have similar structure but different functions. So if you think about what a crocodile uses its forelimbs for versus what a bat uses its forelimbs for, and a chicken uses its forelimbs for. Okay? Similar in structure, but they are different in function. We're talking about walking, flying, and this one's kind of flying as well. Analogous is just the opposite. Similar in function, but different in structure. So these guys here, birds, their forelimbs are used for flying. Butterfly, also used for flying, but they are not even close to having the same structure. And then a vestigial structure is a structure that no longer has a function. Our appendix is one of them. Eyes of sightless cave fish, okay? They still have the eyes, but they don't function. They don't use them because it's so dark down in the caves. This right here shows homologous structures. Human uses our forelimbs to grasp. This is to walk. A whale is to swim, and a bat is to fly. And they've highlighted in the different colors the portions that are very similar. Okay, so similar structure, different function. And this guy here now shows different structure, similar in function. These are all used to fly, but they are all very, very different in structure. And this shows the flightless bird. Okay, these guys don't fly anymore, but yet they still have wings. And these guys can't see anymore, but yet they still have eyes. I would highlight this whole slide. And this just shows the different embryos of different organisms and kind of how similar they are. And it kind of shows the different evidences for evolution with that. So also genetic studies, they can take DNA and suggest close ancestors. And that is it, the end.